Now that you're here at Grief to Growth, I'd like to ask you to do three things. The first thing is to make sure that you like, click notifications, and subscribe to make sure you get updates from my YouTube channel. Also, if you'd like to support me financially, you can support me through my tip jar at grief2growth.com. It's grief, the number 2, growth.com/tip jar. Or look for tip jar at the very top of the page or buy me a coffee at the very bottom of the page, and you can make a small financial contribution. The third thing I'd like to ask is to make sure you share this with a friend through all your social media, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. Thanks for being here. Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey everybody, this is Brian back with another episode of Grief to Growth, and today I've got with me Colleen Murphy. Colleen's got a really interesting story to tell about her and her daughter Lauren, so I'm going to read her introduction and then we'll get started. Colleen Murphy is a wife, she's a mother of 7, she's an author, and she's a public speaker. In 2013, tragedy struck her family when her second oldest daughter Lauren was hit by a car and suffered from brain damage. Her main focus became helping Lauren piece her life back together again. With the help of specialists from all over the country, her family and friends, as well as her strong faith, she was able to do that. Today, Colleen and Lauren often speak together as a team. They inspire thousands of people by sharing the details of Lauren's tragic accident, her never-give-up attitude, and her miraculous recovery. Colleen lives just outside of St. Louis, Missouri with her husband, Dave. She spends her free time fielding countless phone calls from her children as they deal with the challenges of adulting. I bet that is a lot of phone calls with 7 children. And assisting her husband FaceTime as he struggles to find things at the grocery store. So with that, I want to bring in Colleen Murphy.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing great, Colleen. It's good to meet you. We just met a little while ago face to face, but I know a little bit about your story with Lauren. So, but fill me in on the background, the details of what happened with Lauren and how you got to be where you are today.
Sure. So, Lauren was 25, living in New York City. She got her master's degree by the age of 24, hopped on a plane with nothing but a dream and 2 suitcases and moved to New York City. And she created a great life for herself in a short amount of time. She was killing it. I had still 3 kids at home. You know, the oldest was out on her own, also with a master's degree. And I had 2 kids in college and a junior in high school, an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old. So, you know, typical work day. And I got that dreaded phone call, you know, that every parent, you know, fears. And it was from a Los Angeles detective. Lauren had been on a business trip and she was training for the New York Marathon. She had just been accepted into the New York Marathon. So she was super excited. And I actually had talked to her that morning. I actually woke her up. It was the weekend of, it was right after the Boston marathon bombings. And her boyfriend at the time was from Boston. So I called her to see, you know, if his family had been affected because they were like closing in on the suspect. The city was on lockdown. And I forgot about the time difference. She was in Los Angeles on that business trip. So I woke her up. So I chatted with her briefly on my way to work. And then I went into parking garage and lost her. So I never even got to say goodbye on the phone. And then it was a few hours later at the end of my workday that detective called me. And the first thing he said was, "How are you related to Lauren Murphy?" Now, my first thought is, oh God, what does she do? You know, I'm like, why are the police calling me? And he went on to tell me that she'd been involved in an accident. My next thought is, why isn't she calling me? And as the conversation unfolded, you know, I was realizing that we were dealing with something more than a broken bone or two. And the next call was to a hospital social worker. And I actually asked the detective, and I don't know why, I think it's just mother's intuition. I asked if she had head trauma. And he said no. He said that she did not have head trauma, but he thought she had some internal injuries and gave me the name of this social worker to call. So that was the next call. And actually, my husband wasn't. He didn't answer the phone. He never answers when I call. Typical. So I called the social worker and she answered on the first ring. And again, I asked, you know, does she have head trauma? And she said yes. I'm sorry, but she has severe head trauma. So
Mm.
the next question I didn't want to ask, but I knew I had to, especially being in St. Louis. And I asked if she was going to die. And there was a very long pause. And she said, if you're asking me to come, if you need to come, the answer is yes. So hung up, called my husband, he answered this time. And we made arrangements to get out on the first flight out of Lambert Airport. And it was probably 2 a.m. St. Louis time by the time we reached Los Angeles. And, once we got there, our journey began, and it was bad. It was really bad.
Wow. So yeah, getting that call, I'm sure must have been devastating, especially
Mhm.
being, so far away. So when you were on the flight, I guess you had no idea what to expect when you got there. You just knew it wasn't going to be great.
No, and I got the phone call from the brain surgeon at the airport. Now, she was a Jane Doe for several hours, which was just a whole nother layer of grief for me, because I felt like, she was a name without a face. Like, did they know how loved she was? And, blah, 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 all that stuff. But I got the phone call from the brain surgeon, and it went straight to voicemail. So I called back to the hospital, and I was connected to her ICU nurse.
Hmm.
And he was the one that informed me that she was out of surgery. Her vitals were good, and he went through all of the stuff. And then he told me that they had to do a lobectomy, which I had no idea what that meant,
Mm.
but I knew it didn't mean anything good. And what that meant was they had to remove a portion of her brain,
Hmm.
and they removed a very large section of her left temporal lobe. So at that point, I'm like, not only is she going to live, but if she lives, what kind of life is she going to have? And I asked him if she was ever going to be able to live a normal life. And he just responded that he didn't know. So
Wow.
that's what I got at the airport. So, in the airplane, it was a tough ride. And I paid for the internet, and my oldest daughter had verbal permission from me to talk to the hospital. They knew that they could talk to her. She was calling the hospital every hour on the hour and emailing me the
Hmm.
updates. So I had a little bit of information, but really not much.
Okay. So when you got there, what happened?
So the charge nurse actually met us in the parking lot, which I thought, wow, this is great. This hospital has great service. I didn't realize it was because our situation was so dire. I just thought,
Yeah.
well, they're really good in LA. They don't do this in St. Louis.
Yeah.
So she met us in the parking lot and got us, to where we went. And, when we walked in, all eyes were on us. Everybody in the ICU unit, knew how bad it was and were waiting for us to arrive. And when we crossed over that threshold, it was tough, and to see her, she didn't even look like herself. Every part of her was swollen, and it was more from the surgery, from the accident. She had a broken scapula, but no
Hmm.
other broken bones other than her skull. But her face was so swollen, and her eyes were so swollen. And this was all from the surgery, not the accident. She had a little scratch on her index finger. iPhone wasn't even cracked, which was crazy. But her whole face was just, totally swollen. Her eyeballs looked like she had golf balls stuck under her eye sockets, and they were
Mm.
black and blue, but it was all from the surgery. And the nurse kind of just explained what all of the machines were, what they were doing, and their functions. And then they paged a doctor that was on call, and he came down to talk to us and told us that she was the sickest patient in the whole hospital, and that if she survived, we were looking at months, possibly years of recovery. And at that point, I worked in a hospital setting on the insurance side. So I have seen patients in rough shape. So it wasn't as shocking. I mean, it's my daughter, so it's shocking.
Yeah.
But my poor husband, he knew nothing about head injuries, and luckily there was a chair there to catch him, because just hearing that was really, really hard. And, he asked if we had questions, and we didn't even want to know the answers. So we were silent. There was no questions to ask, because I did at that point, I was just absorbing everything, but I still wanted to call BS on her being the sickest patient in the whole hospital. I wanted to go knock on doors, and find, surely there was somebody sicker than, my kid. This is a big complex, but it was tough. It was, it
Hmm.
was a tough pill to swallow. So the first couple of days were just basically, shock.
So at that point, I guess it was just wait and see for the first couple of days, or did you have to make decisions, or how did that go?
They never did ask us to make any decisions, which is good, because for me, I always felt like, I would take care of her in any capacity that God gifted me. it's my child and I'm willing to do that. But once you find yourself in that situation, you sit there and think, is this what she would want? It's like, it's really, really tough. So they never did talk to us about disconnecting life support or anything, but they did call us in for a meeting at one point. This was like a week or two later. And I asked, do I need to fly her siblings here to say goodbye? And again, another long pause. I hated those long pauses. And finally, someone spoke up and said, we have ways to prolong things when that happens, when and if that happens, so it really wasn't the answer I wanted. I wanted him to say, no, we don't need to fly anybody out here to say goodbye. But what they were saying to me was, that's a possibility, but it's not going to be like a quick thing. We could keep her alive with machines if needed. So it was really, really bleak. And there was not much hope. But there's always hope. And that's what I hung on to.
So what was her brain activity like at this point? Were they saying that her brain was she in a coma? I mean, what was her state?
Yeah, she was in a coma and she was so unstable they couldn't do an MRI. So what they started doing is laying her flat on the bed and to try to get her ready for an MRI because they brought her down once and her heart rate dipped down to the 20s. So they had to bring her back up. So it was probably 3 or 4 weeks before we were even stable enough for an MRI. So they really did not know. And then once she came out of her coma, which was a couple of weeks later, but it was almost worse. It's not like soap operas. You don't wake up and, start talking to people. It was just blankness, in her eyes. I've never seen somebody with their eyes open that couldn't focus. It's almost like, when you bring home a newborn and they can't really look. That's how she was, but it looks worse on an adult, it's because it's just not normal. So I remember thinking, God, forgive me, just please close your eyes. It was just too hard to look at her that blank. So once she emerged from the coma, she was in a semi-vegetative state for months after, where we didn't know if she knew who we were, who she was, where she was, anything like that.
So what was your mental state like at this time? She's there, she's not really there. What kind of prognosis did they give you at that point?
They really didn't give us a prognosis. Now, her brain surgeon, there was a team of neurodocs and then her brain surgeon. Now, the neurodocs were not as warm and fuzzy as the brain surgeon, surprisingly, because most brain surgeons do not have a lot of personality, but we were lucky and we had one who we just love and still keep in contact with. But I remember the first day he met me, he said, right now I'm looking for something positive to give you. And I'm going to have to dig really, really deep. But if I keep reaching, I'm going to find it. And that's what I'm going to give you. So, he was basically telling me things are really, really bad, but we're going to focus on the good things. The other docs were focusing on all the bad things. So, that was fine. But after we got the MRI back, the one doctor came in and said, it's bad. It's really bad, because it wasn't so much just the damage on the left side where it was the point of impact. He said that it was similar to like shaken baby syndrome, because when she flew through the air with such velocity, it damaged all parts of her brain. So there was damage throughout. And when the neurosurgeon came back in to talk to me, he said, if you were going to ask me if she could ever live on her own independently in New York again, I would have to say that I don't know. But what I can tell you is it's not out of the realm of possibilities. And that's all I needed to hear.
Wow.
It's anything's possible. So I just kind of hung on to that, even though there really wasn't a very good prognosis. Now, the other doctor, who was kind of Dr. Gloom and Doom, he had told us that, early on, if she did survive, she'd probably remain in a wheelchair and maybe even have to be in some type of assisted living center if she survived this. So I liked my other doctors, his prognosis a little better than that one. So you just kind of have to hang on to the positive.
So that's what I was just going to say. So you made a choice there. You made a conscious choice to hang on to the positive.
Yeah. So, and my husband chose the other side, not to throw him under the bus, but he's just kind of like it is what it is type thing. And we were a good balance. So in times where I was just almost like too positive and we're going to get out of this, he would kind of reel me back a little bit. We don't know that, he's just trying to prepare me for the worst. Not that he, didn't want what I was seeing,
Hmm.
envisioning, but we've just always been a pretty good balance.
No, I perfectly understand. I'm probably more like your husband.
Yeah.
I hear the worst, and
Yes.
I was talking to, I think it was my daughter about this a couple of days ago, and sometimes we try to prepare ourselves
Hmm.
by thinking the worst, but it sounds like that's not really your philosophy. You were like holding on to the positive.
Yeah, and I don't know that that was always my philosophy. I just that mother's instinct kicked in. I don't really consider myself an overly positive, optimistic person. I don't consider myself a negative person,
Hmm.
but I completely just embraced that, at the time of her accident.
So I'm curious as to did you have a spiritual practice, a faith? Did that
Mhm.
play into your outlook?
Yes. So, obviously, I'm a good Catholic with 7 kids. So I've always been spiritual. I've always, and I think once I started having children, like in my younger years, church was never a priority. The foundation was always there, and I
Hmm.
always, kind of talked to God, but it wasn't as important to me until I had kids and wanted them to have the same upbringing that I was fortunate to have. So all of my kids, went all through Catholic schools. They were taught to know God, to love Jesus. And, in the very beginning, it was kind of like, and again, that whole Catholic guilt, like, why me? What did I do? What did I do to cause this? What did I do wrong? What could I have done better to where my child wasn't critically injured? And that's not how God works, but that was just the human side of me. And then I went through the phases of, you know, I, there were so many people that were brought back to faith because of Lauren's accident and recovery, and that would reach out to me, and which I'm flattered. I think it's great, but part of me is like, I've always been faithful. Why was it my kid that had to be this example to bring somebody else back? But again, that's not how God works. And, nobody has a quota of tragic things happen to them. I kind of felt like I already had some tragic things happen in my life. I lost my dad young. My husband lost his father young. One of our daughters had a lot of surgery when she was little. I'm like, okay, my quota's done,
Yeah.
but that's not how it works. There isn't a quota. Sometimes life just dumps on you, and there's no, phew, I survived that, I'm done, because even now I don't know what's around the corner. So I had I had a real struggle with that. My faith never wavered, but I mean, I guess I could say it wavered, but my faith was never gone. There
Hmm.
were times where I was angry, but that was also, my rock during, the hardest times. And that's all I had to cling to is my faith. And my husband and I often say, I don't know how people do this without faith. It's really, I can't imagine, and there's lots of good people that don't have faith, but I just think, where do you turn, when there's nothing there? It was really, really, I think, what helped me in the beginning and all throughout.
Well, again, I think that's a choice that you made and that people make because when tragedy strikes, it can strengthen our faith or it can totally rupture our
Mhm.
faith. And you mentioned something earlier about like, what did I do to cause this as being kind of a Catholic thing. We all kind of, I think all parents go through that when something happens to our kids.
Mhm.
It may be framed around our religion, that we're
Sure.
Catholic or we're whatever. But even if we're not, it's like as parents, we always take responsibility for our kids,
Oh
no
yeah.
matter how old they are, right? So
Yeah.
your daughter here, she is, she's grown, she's living in New York, she's in LA, but still somehow you're responsible
Yeah.
for what happened to her.
And it's funny too that as parents, like, I never take credit for the great things they do. Why is it that we only take credit for the bad things that happen? It's just, we're just not wired that way, unfortunately. But yeah, it's just, mom guilt is strong.
It is, and as I said, I want to just let everybody know that's listening. I work with a lot of parents who have had children that have died, and it's almost universal. It's almost
Mhm.
universal when something happens to our kids. Somehow we find a way to blame ourselves. And I
Yeah.
know a mother that was killed by a drunk driver. Her daughter was in her 30s, and this woman was like, "It was my fault." And how was it your fault? She said, literally, I did 7 things wrong that day. And I said, 7? And
Yeah.
she listed the 7 things she did wrong, and her daughter didn't even live with her. And I said, you probably do seven things wrong every day if you're going to break
Yeah.
it down like that.
Yeah.
So, but that's
Yeah.
the irrational part of us. That's the parent
Yes.
part of us that kicks in. So, so Lauren, how long was she in the hospital total? So catch me up with how that worked out.
So she was in the hospital total 127 days.
Okay.
She was in ICU for 5 weeks, and then they moved her to the regular floor. And then once she was medically stable, they airlifted her by private medical jet to a rehab hospital in Chicago, which we were very lucky. She was accepted into one of the best rehab hospitals in the country, which
Okay.
was RIC. It's now called Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, but at that time it was Rehab Institute of Chicago, and
Hmm.
it was 5 hours driving distance for the rest of my family, which is great. And, it was, I had an apartment. Somebody gave me an apartment that was a mile from the hospital so I could walk back and forth, which was just amazing. I mean, the community and people were just, I mean, I could tell you stories and stories and stories of things that people did for us that really lifted us up. But so she was there. Um, another 3.5 months, I guess. And, that was where, our journey really began. That was where the hard work started. Um, and still, even when she came home, she was still in, rough shape. She was finally walking again, not steady. It took her several months to learn how to walk. I mean, she relearned everything. She couldn't hold her head up. She couldn't eat. She couldn't do anything. But that was where the growth really happened, was at RIC. And she had her fourth brain surgery while she was there also.
Okay. So, at what point were you able to, or was she able to communicate with you, and vice versa? At what point did she show signs that she was able to hear your communication?
Yeah. So she was nonverbal for a long time. So that was hard. And it's amazing how, I was in tune to her needs, because she
Mm.
was incontinent, but I could tell just by the way she positioned her body that if she needed to be changed, or, it's like, we were at this part of our recovery. We were just like, if she scratched her forehead, we were like so excited, because that was something that was not involuntary. Like most of her movements were involuntary. So it
Hmm.
was really, really slow progress. So, I never really knew if she knew who I was, which was really hard. Although there was one moment back when we were still in LA, and one of my daughters was visiting, and they had the TV on, and it was Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And there was a close up of Kris Jenner, and Lauren just kind of stuck her finger up in the air, like she had an idea, kind of like sticking
Hmm.
her one finger up. And we started laughing because we're like, I think she recognizes Kris Jenner. And I'm like, I
Hmm.
really thought I would be the first person she recognized,
Yeah,
but
really.
progress is progress. I don't, but outside of that little one thing, which could have been a fluke, when we arrived home, we came home and there was over 200 people lining the streets cheering us on. And we all like stood in a group for a group picture. And one of our old neighbors in our old neighborhood was there. And Lauren used to watch her dog for her all the time. And when she saw her, Lauren's eyes lit up and she reached out to give her a hug. So
Mm.
that was the first time that we knew that she recognized somebody from her past. Because with us, we were always there. So it
Hmm.
was never like an awakening. Every
Hmm.
day I was there. So, it's like as she improved, I didn't notice much, and you never really could tell that she knew who I was. So when she recognized that neighbor, that's when we all kind of knew, okay, she's still in there. She's got
Yeah.
memories and she knows who people are. She loves us and she loves us.
So this was after she'd been to rehab, obviously. So
Yeah.
this is when when you brought her home. So this was
Yeah.
quite a while when
Yeah.
you weren't really sure that she recognized you.
Yeah.
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 So what was it like once you got her home?
So then it was kind of like everything's on me, and I was doing a lot at the rehab hospital. It was important for me to learn how to care for her, because there was like so many moments where I just felt so incompetent. I couldn't lift her from the bed to her chair. I couldn't position her. And, this time she was only like 90, 95 pounds, and she was a small girl ahead of time. But, when she was on a feeding tube, I mean, she was just down to skin and bones.
Hmm.
But I felt so incompetent that I really wanted to learn everything. So I was doing most of her care, including her showers. I would shave her legs every other day, which was backbreaking. But the only thing I wasn't doing was her medication. So that
Okay.
was kind of the new thing. So once I got home, it's kind of like, okay, now what? And then she started with outpatient rehab. So then I have to, get her in the car. And then, because she has a brain injury, she's confused. And I have to worry about her opening the door handle. while we're driving,
Hmm.
because she would constantly be taking her seatbelt off of her wheelchair, and she still wasn't steady on her feet. She didn't understand the whole concept of can't get out of the car when it's moving. Those type of things was just like a danger zone at home.
Yeah.
There's flights of stairs, there's butcher knives, there's, the whole thing. So it was really hard to adjust. And then not only that, construction started shortly after on our home. And we had to make it handicap accessible and wheelchair accessible. And this particular house that we were in, we bought after Lauren had already moved out. So she never had a bedroom there. So we had
Hmm.
to build an extra bedroom onto the house. And so we were under construction for about 6 months and just
Wow.
dealing with the construction and the ladders and the drywall and where she's just like doesn't understand the world that she lives in at this point, was tough. It was really, really tough, but looking back, there's a lot of funny stuff in it, but it just wasn't real funny at the time.
Yeah, I know someone who's going through something similar with someone that had an aneurysm.
Mm,
It's been like 3 years now, and that's people don't understand how draining that is
mhm.
to constantly have to be watching people to do things that just leaving the door open,
Yeah,
just things that they forget, turning the stove on and walking away.
yeah, yeah,
All
it's
all
tough.
those little things that we don't think about with an adult that's mobile and not
Yes,
quite functioning
yes,
properly.
yeah, getting into medication, and we had to get a lockbox on her medicine, and all kinds of things. It was just, one time I woke up at like 3 in the morning and she had made biscuits, and I'm like, how in the heck did I not hear her? And how did she open the Pillsbury biscuits? I can't open those on a good day. I
Wow,
have no
really?
idea how she did that. She didn't cook before the accident. She could only do microwave popcorn, so I don't know how she did it. But yeah, so I mean, it was tough. We had to get a a security system that sent me a text message every time there was movement.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, I'm a hard sleeper, so I'd wake up to a string of texts that she had been moving all night, but no idea. But it was really, really hard in the beginning.
So at what point? Because she's still not very communicative at this point. Or were you
Mm-mm.
having conversations, but she was just moving
No,
around and doing things?
no. So
Okay,
she could say like, "Hi, how are you? Good morning," and she didn't really start doing that till we got home. She
okay,
can,
right.
and it started out as a whisper, and then it became like her real voice. And we didn't know it at the time, and they mentioned it that she had something called aphasia.
Hmm.
And I didn't really know what that meant. And I didn't know what a difference it was going to make in her recovery. Because even now, that's like her biggest roadblock as far as her recovery. And aphasia is caused by damage to the brain, and it's very common in strokes.
Hmm.
But for Lauren, it was because that whole language portion of her brain was removed. So that is why she couldn't really speak. And she also couldn't understand us. And we didn't know that at the time. But it was almost
Oh,
like you're talking to it in a different language. So you ask her a question, she can't answer it. She has no idea what you're saying.
wow.
So that's why that she could do the good morning, how are you, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, anything that she doesn't have to think about, anything that's an automatic, she could say. But I could ask her to point to the door. She couldn't do it. But she might be able to say, shut the door, because it
Hmm.
was an automatic. But if I ask her what that object was, it was just, aphasia was really hard to wrap your head around and really
Right,
hard to understand.
right.
But she was, for almost 2 years, she really couldn't talk in any type of conversational way. She's done speech, OT, and PT for years, and she still does speech therapy. But she was not verbal in any way. We could not have any type of conversation. She couldn't order her own food. She couldn't do any of that for years.
So as you're going through this, so you got her home, that she's going to survive, but what were they telling you in terms of her chances for recovery, being able to have a meaningful conversation, even?
Yeah, so they really didn't, they've always said, with brain injury, no two brain injuries are the same. It's like when you
Right,
break a bone, they know how to fix it.
right.
When you break your brain, they don't know. And I remember when we left RIC, the doctor, like her last day walking the halls, he said, Lauren, I don't know what magical combination you need to beat this, but you obviously have it. And, she's surpassed every doctor's expectations and still continues to surpass expectations. So, obviously, like the first year is probably the most important, because those improvements can be gauged. Like, she can hold her head up, she can now eat, she doesn't need a feeding tube, she can walk on her own. But the rest of the progress has been painfully slow. We're almost at 9 years, and I don't know if she'll ever be able to live independently again. She still has some cognitive deficits and sometimes makes some choices that aren't the best. She also has some really bad OCD, and it's the compulsions that are really, really bad, and it's caused by brain damage. So the medications that normally help with OCD don't really help with her.
Hmm.
And things like she's got to get the mail the minute the mailman comes. Doesn't matter if there's a sheet of ice on the ground. She's got to get that mail out of the mailbox. So things like that we still struggle with. Every
Hmm.
day is a little better, but I don't think we're ever going to be 100%. But she's living a life filled with purpose again, and we again have lots of bad days, but I don't have brain damage and I have lots of bad days. So,
Yeah.
it's just kind of, a lot of times I have to step back when I'm annoyed and be thankful for what I still have. But it's still tough. And, she's not always the nicest to her siblings. And that's hard too, because they've went through a lot, and the
Hmm.
siblings are often forgot about during a tragedy. And I think, the siblings, when they have their own little problems, they don't like to come to the parents with them because they think, oh, they got their hands full. And, that's what I need, is to be able to do my job and feel normal. I want them to come to me with their problems, but I think sometimes they're afraid to. They don't want to burden me with more, and it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I've got great kids, but it's still, it's not an easy road.
We'll get back to grief to growth in just a few seconds. Did you know that Brian is an author and a life coach? If you're grieving or know someone who is grieving, his book, Grief to Growth, is a best selling, easy to read book that might help you or someone you know. People work with Brian as a life coach to break through barriers and live their best lives. You can find out more about Brian and what he offers at www.grieftogrowth.com, www.gref2growth.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/grieftogrowth, www.patreon.com/grief2growth to make a financial contribution. And now, back to Grief to Growth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I can imagine it's not an easy road. And before we started recording, you mentioned the term called ambiguous grief. So tell
Mhm.
me what that's like for you.
Sure. So ambiguous grief is a word that I had to look up in the dictionary to understand what it meant. But it's when you're grieving somebody that's still here. And it's hard because every day I miss the old Lauren. And there's some things where we say she's new and improved. And there's some things where I wish some of the old Lauren was still there. And it's hard. And you grieve for what could have been, and what was. But then you also feel guilty because there's people that have lost children, like yourself. And I have a few close friends that have lost children, and I don't want to be a member of that club. And I get it. And that's what keeps me going sometimes, is I think those parents would trade places with me in a heartbeat. Yes, my road hasn't been easy, but my child is still here. I can still hug her. I can still give her a kiss. I can still get mad at her. I can still do all those things that everybody else longs to do. And it really kind of puts things into perspective. And when I'm having a rough day, that's what really fuels me and keeps me going, is that I don't have it so bad.
Yeah, and that's really important because the thing is, everything in life is really a matter of how we look at it. It's really
Mhm.
a matter of perspective. And so for you, I'm thinking as you're going through this, the ups and downs. First, the tragedy of the accident, and then finding out she's going to live at least for a while, and then finding out she's going to live, but she's not able to speak. So there's always a back and forth, and there's always
Yeah,
two ways to look at everything, right? I mean, like you
yeah.
said, you can think about what you've lost with Lauren and what you may never recover,
Hmm.
or you can think about what you have.
Hmm.
And that's a choice that you have decided to make. So I want to continue with Lauren's story though. So Lauren's home now, and she's up moving around, and she's somewhat verbal.
Hmm.
And we've moved from that to a point where now you and Lauren are out speaking. So
Yeah,
how did
yeah,
that
yeah.
transition happen?
Okay, so she goes to a speech clinic at a university. And a lot of universities, so if there's anybody listening that knows anybody with aphasia, a lot of universities that have a SLP, speech language and pathology program, have these clinics to where the grad students work with the aphasia patients. And in our case, it's completely free. They have a grant. In other cases, that I think it's pretty minimal cost for these universities. But she started going to this speech program, and it turns out she was an alma mater at Fontbonne University also. So that's, where she went to school. So it was familiar to her. Mm-hmm. And one of the, they had a group of people with aphasia. And one of the goals that they set for the semester was to come up with something that you want to do that's new to you, that you've never done before, like trying to get, their patients to try new things. Now, Lauren's usually the youngest by far, because again, it's mostly strokes. And there's young people that have strokes too. We know plenty, especially through aphasia, but right. Mm-hmm. In this particular case, everyone's like 60 plus. And then there's Lauren, who's, early 30s. And they also did these like aphasia panels where they get out in the community to try to spread awareness. And Lauren really struggled like reading like a script, like if she had to answer questions and read from there, because reading and writing skills are lost with aphasia on some people, not everybody, but with Lauren it was. Mm-hmm. But then when it went to the Q&A section, she just lit up. She's very social and she loves people. So back to the goal that she had to set. She said she wanted to start doing public speaking. So that was the goal she set. And when she told me, I'm thinking, are you crazy? You're missing the language portion of your brain. Yeah. You have severe aphasia, but you want to be a public speaker. Okay. So once I realized that she was pretty serious about this, and, she really, really, really loves getting out and, sharing her story. And I knew she couldn't do it on her own. So I knew that if we're going to make this happen, I have to step up and do it with her. So we, launched a website, printed business cards. And it's funny because my husband and I, like on the business cards for her, I put Lauren Murphy, TBI survivor, public speaker. My husband's like, she's not a public speaker. I'm like, yes, she is. On the business card, she's a public speaker. So we laugh about that. And then, we did, I thought we'd do a couple Girl Scout troops, maybe what's that? The city Rotary clubs, do a couple Rotary clubs, something like that. So we did, the first request we got was back in New York, and it was a professor at Columbia University, and she had a group of students that were SLP students. So we spoke there, and then we did like a little grade school. And then the Fontbonne professor, who had set all these goals for these patients, she asked us to come in and do our presentation for them. So we did. And then a week later, she asked if we would consider doing it for a bigger audience. I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm like, what do you think, Lauren? Lauren's like, sure. So she was recommending us to do the commencement address that spring. And I was like, okay, I did not expect to do, 2 little speeches and then boom, we're going to speak in front of 3,000 people.
Right. Wow.
So at that point, I was doing most of the talking, and Lauren doesn't remember the first 2 years after her accident. So even if she could speak fluently, she remembers nothing, which, it's funny now that I shaved her legs every other day that she didn't remember that. I definitely wouldn't have done it if I knew she wouldn't remember.
Yeah, really.
So once we started, with commencement, and we were getting the requests in right and left on our website, it was people really wanted to hear her story, which, blew me away. Mm-hmm. So I decided to turn everything off until after commencement, because I couldn't give 2 speeches for her. It would confuse her. She can't work on one. And, it's kind of like working with Dory from Finding Nemo sometimes. So I'm like, how do I get this speech that we've been doing, that's mostly me with her interjecting, to mainly her and with me interjecting? So, I had to come up with a speech that was also not just telling her story. It had to be something for the graduates, so we came up with this speech, we worked together, and then we started practicing it probably 4 or 5 times a day, recording it every time we practice it, listening to it, seeing what worked, seeing what didn't, seeing which jokes hit, which jokes didn't, and then playing it back in the car, in the house, everywhere. She had to be submerged in this commencement address. And by the time commencement rolled around, by every 3rd or 4th try, she nailed it, but it was like, okay, I need like another week to go before we can do this. But typical Lauren, she rose to the occasion, and we delivered this commencement address. And throughout our speech, we had bouts of applause, bouts of laughter. We had a couple video clips that showed really how bad it was, because unless you could see the video and you see this beautiful girl standing there, you would have no idea what she went through. Because she looked bad.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end, over 3,000 people standing ovation, which was pretty amazing. And, since then, the requests have been pouring in, and, it really helps give her a sense of purpose, because she can't go back to work in the old sense that she can't multitask. Her brain doesn't process things right. She can't understand it when people would give her direction. So this is perfect for her. And since the book launched, it's even, gotten even greater. And we have a couple keynote speeches scheduled out of state, which, she loves to travel. So that's really exciting. And it just seems like her reach is getting bigger and bigger. And for me, it's really cool to see, because again, I have to take a step back sometimes to see how inspirational the story is, because it's our story. And even though I know it's miraculous and it's not typical, when it's your own family, you don't realize, wow, this is, bigger than what I thought. And this is bigger than us. And, and for schools, when we speak to the schools, we talk about helmet safety. Now, obviously you don't wear a helmet when you're running, but it's a good way to drive home helmet safety with them, crossing the street safety. And, it's, as adults, you think, yeah, I got it. Well, we're not always as careful as we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely true. So I know your story has gone viral. I mean, I know Lauren's had visits from some very famous people. So tell me about those people, how they got involved.
Sure. So the first, when we were in the ICU, and again, like our community was huge. So the first thing that we received was a shout out video from Lance Bass from NSYNC. Now, my Shannon, who is my fourth daughter, she had a huge crush on Lance Bass when she was like 8 years old. We went to the concert, whatever. So it was almost like as soon as that video showed up, that was the hope that helped her feel like things are going to be okay. This is somebody that I idolized, and he sent me this shout out video. Well, not her, but I mean, all of us. And then we got one from Joey Fatone, which was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody that my husband went to graduate school with remembered that I was a big Rick Springfield fan. She reached out to his camp and told him about the accident. And his manager called me and told me that Rick was going to call me the next day. Heard about the story and how sorry, blah, blah, blah. So this is probably about 3 weeks after the accident, I received a call from Rick Springfield, which, was just like mind blowing to me, because, from the time I was 11, I was like, it's like I was one of those crazy super fans. So he was great. And to see that, my childhood crush was such a good egg and didn't do this for publicity, just cared. And then the biggest celebrity was Taylor Swift. She actually early on gave us a $25,000 donation to fly my family back and forth to LA. And she actually is related to one of Lauren's good friends. So that's how we got that connection with Taylor. But, he had contacted her to see if she could do like a shout out video, and she read our caring bridge and saw some of the stuff and wanted to do more.
Mm-hmm.
And then she came to the hospital to visit, and, she stayed with my husband and I for about 45 minutes. She FaceTimed with the kids at home. She couldn't have been any more gracious. She even left her sweater behind, which we still proudly have in the closet. We did email her manager to see if she wanted it back, but he never responded. So I guess it's ours to keep. But
yeah, really,
the sleeves are a little long. I'm 5'1", so it doesn't work for me, but that's okay. It's still pretty cool to have it. But yeah, but it was great. But even, just the everyday people was what was even better. The people that you don't expect that show up and, just really have your back and really helped us get through, some of our darkest days.
So, what would you say? What do you think it is about Lauren's story that touches people so deeply that you guys are now doing public speaking, and it's gone made national acclaim? So what is it? What do you think that is about the story that really attracts people?
And I think part of it is, at the time of her accident, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just out running, she was just, she was just out doing something that we, everyday thing. And I think a lot of people can see themselves in Lauren, like, we never know, that old expression, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
and, So we all know that and think that, but this is somebody where it actually happened to, and she was always one of those go-getters that was like, I know what I want and I'm going to go get it. I'm going to move to New York. I'm gutsy. She followed the dream that we kind of all have, but we're kind of afraid to do, and I think people always like envied that about her, that she was gutsy. And then when, things took a sudden turn, it just somehow became more tragic. And I think too, when you see her in person, she lights up her room. And, we do a lot of Zoom presentations too, and she does fine. But in person is where she really connects with people. And she could do that beforehand. And I think that's part of it. And then I think on the other side of that is mothers can relate to me because they can put themselves in my shoes. And the taking care of Lauren was the easy part. The hard part was that I had to step away from my other 6 kids while I had to take care of Lauren. And I added up the days that I spent living out of state during her recovery. It was 404 days. Wow. Over a 2-year period. Wow. And that's hard because that's not the kind of mom that I signed up to be. I missed every soccer game. I missed homecomings. I missed, mother-son brunches and all that stuff that I would have never missed. And I know that they understood it and that they get it and that I would do it for them, but it's still hard. But I think it's just, and I also think we don't candy coat it. We have a positive message, but we talk about the hard stuff as much as we do the good stuff. In the end, it's a very uplifting presentation that we give, but we don't hold back, and we're not private people, and I think people can relate to us.
Yeah, but as you're saying this, I think about, I was telling you before we started recording, I work with a lot of parents who have had children that have died or transitioned, as I like to say. Sometimes people shy away when something happens because they want to know what caused it. Have you gotten any of that? Like, what was Lauren doing when it happened, or, wanting to try to find a reason?
Not really. What I get instead is people that say, well, is she ever gonna, be normal? I'm like, I don't know. Are you ever not going to be rude? I just, so I get a lot of that, but nobody really asks too many questions about it. Although people that have read the book that know me well say, oh, I never knew that, and I didn't know that part, and I didn't know that part. Because in the very beginning, when we shared stuff, I wasn't the one sharing, it was on Caring Bridge. So it was being translated by, other people. But I don't think a lot, what's the hardest for me is the people that don't ask questions, the people that just kind of like drifted away like they were in the witness protection program. They don't know what to say, so they say nothing. And I think I've really changed on the way I do things too. And again, like I've said, I have friends that have lost children, and I would be, less inclined to say that child's name because I don't want to bring it up and make them sad. Now, there's not a second that goes by that any of those parents aren't thinking about that child. Bringing up that child's name isn't going to make them sad. It's going to make them feel like somebody is validating my child and that their time on earth was important. So I don't avoid that conversation anymore, or I used to. And I think sometimes when people don't say anything, it's not because they don't care. It's because they're afraid. And I think, that's just a stigma with, everyone's like, oh my gosh, I could never do that. I don't know how somebody could do it, but avoiding them isn't the answer. You need to embrace them. And so I do things differently when there's a tragedy or if someone's lost a child, and it's really changed my way of thinking. And my least favorite phrase in the whole entire world is everything happens for a reason. And when people say that, I want to smack them. And I feel like, there are good things that can come from a bad thing happening. Absolutely good things can come from that. But there is nobody on this earth that will ever convince me that there's a good reason that my kid was critically injured and fights for everything that she has right now. Yes, good things have come from that, and she has found her purpose again. But, the reason is God gave us free will. And unfortunately, she walked in front of a car, and we're making the best of it. But I just don't like that phrase. And maybe that's just me, but it's just not my mantra.
Yeah. And that's a really great point, because we all have different views about things,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, and we all have our triggers, right? We all have
Mm-hmm.
phrases that really
Mm-hmm.
get us, which is one of the reasons why people are scared to say things. There's a couple of reasons. One is they don't want to make you sad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, I brought up Lauren, you started crying, therefore it's my fault because I made you think
Yeah.
about her. Well,
Yeah.
as you said, I want to make everybody know I think about my daughter all day long, every day.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not going to make me think about her. The idea of everything happening for a reason is, it's actually an idea that I have come to embrace, but it's not to say that like God caused it or anything like that. But there is, as you said, something good can come out of it. So we can talk about what does that phrase really mean.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes people use it as a I call it spiritual bypassing.
Mm-hmm.
So it to imply, well, Colleen, you should be happy that this happened
Mm-hmm.
because this is actually a good thing. No,
Mm-hmm.
two things can be true at the same time. It
Yeah.
could be a really bad thing that happened, but something good came out of it. Or even more appropriate, we made something good come out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you and Lauren have taken what happened and you've decided this is the way I'm going to look at it. I'm going to look at it this way. This is what I'm going to do with it. I'm not going to lay down and die.
Mm-hmm.
And both those things are true. You know, you would not have, you wouldn't choose this if you could
Mm-mm.
go back and undo. I don't want to speak for you.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. No. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So I can understand, why you would say that. So I want to say to people that are listening, because it's tough on both of us. It's tough when we're the person that's grieving,
Mm-hmm.
and you are grieving because you're grieving the loss of the life you thought Lauren was going to have and you were going to have, and the time with the other kids and all those
Mm-hmm.
things. And that's really grief. And it's also difficult on the person that's trying to console you or whatever. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess the thing is, I would say to people, let's be open. Let's listen to each other. And if someone says something to you that hurts you, that you don't like, we can gently correct them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't subscribe to that.
Yeah.
And let them know why you feel that way. I think it's really a matter of communication. But I
Sure.
experienced some of the same thing you did. I mean, people that just disappeared out of my life
Mm-hmm.
when my daughter passed, or people you could tell with awkward silences. But on the other hand, the community, the people that step forward, the
Oh
same
yeah.
thing that you've
Uh-huh.
experienced, and that's a really great thing that comes out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also, when we speak, I always say too, there's so many times where you hear something tragic happening and you think, I don't really know them. They're just a friend of a friend. That would be weird. I'm not going to reach out. And I always say, if you get that feeling, reach out. You can send somebody a text or an email. You're not bothering them. They can delete your text. They can delete your email. They can choose not to respond. You can drop a package on their porch. But those, for me, when those packages showed up or when those texts showed up, they always showed up when they are at my lowest point. And that's
Yeah.
what lifted me up. So it's like, if somebody is giving you that inkling, to me, it's the Holy Spirit. So for whatever your belief is, whatever that inkling is, do it.
Yeah.
It's anytime you have a chance to do good, do it, because you never know what's working in the back that's using you to help somebody else feel better.
Yeah, and this isn't about me, but I want to just throw the story in here real quick, because for what you just said, because there was a person that we knew when Shayna passed away, kind of an acquaintance. Her daughter and our daughter were really good friends, and we carpooled with them. So I drove her daughter back and forth a few times, but we weren't that close. And after Shayna passed, her daughter said to her, "You need to go over and talk to Mrs. Smith, my wife. You need to go on walks with her." And she's like, "I don't really know them. I don't think that's going to be appropriate because I'm not the closest person."
Mhm.
And now this couple are two of our closest friends. We hang out with
Mhm.
them all the time,
Oh, love
and it's
that.
because her daughter said you should do this,
Yeah.
and she followed through on it. So you
Hmm.
never know how you're going to impact someone's life when you when
Yeah.
you follow that inkling. So
Yeah.
I like what you just said there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those are the best. The people that you don't expect are the ones that touch you the most.
Yes, yes, it can be. It's
Mhm.
it's really wild because the people that you think are going to step up, it's the opposite
Mhm.
too, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes even some
Yeah,
family
we could go
members.
there, but I'm not going to.
Well, people, it's uncomfortable, and for
Mhm.
some people, it's just easier to just. And this is the way I look at it. I have a really good friend that I don't. He was a good friend. We don't talk anymore, and it was I don't know if that was why or not, but it's like that's just life.
Mhm.
So we don't. I try not to judge people. I'm just like they're just not there yet.
Yeah.
But like you, I love your attitude. It's like let's focus on the good things. Let's focus on the
Mhm.
people that stepped up.
Yeah.
Let's focus on the life that you have with Lauren that you at that time when you got that phone call, might not have expected to
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. For sure.
So, what is life with Lauren like now, like on a day-to-day basis?
So, the pandemic's kind of,
Mhm.
obviously been tough. It's been
Yeah.
tough on all of us, but for someone that's really, really social, it's really hard. So when we have speeches scheduled, she is on cloud nine, and she's, completely pleasant, and she's got, a lot to look forward to. She does stay busy with, she works out with a trainer twice a week. And
Mm.
then she works with Disabled Athletes Association, who are fabulous. And they do, she does a workout with them one day a week. And then she also does adaptive swimming, adaptive rock climbing. And in the summer, she's done adaptive tennis. And, we try to keep her as busy and keep her out of, shopping as much as possible, because she has very expensive taste.
Oh,
She loves to shop. So we try to keep her busy. What we really struggle with is her finding activities when she's bored,
right.
because TV is not really an option because she can't follow the dialogue. Reading isn't an option because she can only read like small phrases. So it's really hard to find something to do that doesn't have language
Right.
entailed. So, she really enjoys watching, the Cardinals and the Blues, because, following sports is easy,
Hmm.
but it's hard for her on her downtime. She really struggles with that. But like I said, when we have speeches booked, she is on cloud nine. We also have a couple vacations coming up, and we're going to Hawaii, and we found someone that teaches adaptive surfing.
Oh, wow.
So, it's important for me that she feels, like she's able to accomplish things still and still do things, because she's watching, especially her younger siblings. The baby was 11 at the time of the accident. She was 25. So watching her younger sister start driving and going to college and living life and, surpassing her is tough. And even like watching her nieces and nephew, like her niece is 3 and talks so well. And she's always like, Avery talks so well. I'm like, well, Avery has all of her brain. You can't be so hard on yourself,
Yeah.
so it's hard for her to see, them surpass, because she's aware, which is a good thing, because for a long time she wasn't aware.
Hmm.
But, it's hard, but, she's still very thankful to be alive. And, we just try to keep her as busy as we can. The downtime is hard. And I think one thing the pandemic taught me is that I'm perfectly content sitting in sweatpants all day and doing nothing. But unfortunately, my daughter is not. So, we try to keep her as busy as we can.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be a real challenge.
Yeah.
As you said, yeah, I think about because I'm home all day every day, and but I can watch TV, I can
Hmm.
read. So if you take those activities away, and when you're locked in a pandemic, that
Hmm.
leaves very few options. So I'm sure that's a challenge for you to find ways to
Yeah.
keep her, engaged. So hopefully we'll be out
Yeah.
of this soon, and people
Yeah.
can start getting out a little bit
Yeah.
more.
It is hard. But yeah, I mean, it's getting better, but it's hard. So we need that speaking calendar to fill up. And we actually have had a slow January and February, but spring, we're almost like April, we're almost booked solid. So, it's looking up, but it's just been a, slow, dreary month.
Yeah. So are these in-person speeches you guys are doing,
We do
or
both. Yeah. Most
okay?
of them are in person.
Wow.
But yeah, we do both. And we are in Missouri, they're not, the lockdown is not, there's like the area where I live, it's mask optional. And even like with schools, different parts of the country are stricter in different areas. So we're able
Right.
to go into the schools, when we do schools, and, different corporations too.
Hmm.
It just depends on where you are. And the ones that are a little stricter, we do them virtually, and it's fine.
So tell me about where your mantra came from. Murphy's don't quit.
So that one, I can't claim that for myself. That one was my husband. And, from the time the kids were little, whatever they wanted to quit, whether they were like, I don't want to do softball, like,
Oh,
well, you got to
okay.
finish the year. Murphys don't quit. You signed up for this. We're going to finish. Whether they're pairing up socks, that was always my go-to punishment. With a family of 9, you can imagine our sock basket was just overflowing. So whenever they were in trouble, I didn't just send them to their room. I sent them to their room with the sock pit, and they had to match socks. So I'm like,
Hmm.
Murphys don't quit. You're going to sit here until all these socks are matched. So that's kind of where it came from. And, he's always used it. And, he would try to use it on me too with whatever, like, oh, Murphys don't quit. I'm not a Murphy. I married into this name,
Yeah,
so I
really.
can quit. But, never did anybody, encompass that family mantra, than Lauren, during her recovery. So it just kind of it kind of stuck. And, we had the support t-shirts said Murphys Don't Quit, and the bracelets and the website. So, the title of my book was actually something different. And a couple of writers' conferences recommended that I change the title to that because it matched the website, and it worked. Wasn't my first choice, but I'm not the one that was going to be buying it. So I had to put my ego aside and, let them change the title.
It's funny. I was just before we got on this interview, I was interviewing another author, and same thing. She had a title for a book, and everybody made her change. So what was your original title?
So my original title was Lauren's Jane Doe name, which was Trauma Foxtrot 5395.
Okay.
So, and it just, for me, it was kind of like that's not her name, but kind of like a hell yeah, Trauma Foxtrot survived this. But, obviously it doesn't make sense. It doesn't tell you what the story is about, but really Murphys Don't Quit doesn't tell you what the story is about, but it kind of does. It tells you that, there's not quitting involved. So, so it works. It's hard when you write a book. It's kind of like your baby, and, it's hard. Your vision, is not, sometimes the publisher doesn't agree with your vision, but you just gotta be flexible.
Yeah. So the book just came out recently, right?
Yes. October 5th, which was Lauren's birthday.
Wow.
They told me it had to be a Tuesday in October, and I'm like, well, perfect. Her birthday fell on a Tuesday. So yeah, it dropped October 5th, and it's done really, really well. So we're excited.
Awesome. Well, obviously you guys are accepting speaking engagements. Sounds like you're looking for them, so people can go to, I want you to give your website.
Sure. It's murphysdon'tquit.com.
Okay.
And there's a contact tab. You can reach us there, and email us. I respond to even if you just have a comment, or whatever question. Also, any TBI families or anybody going through, I am always open to helping other families, go through whatever. I don't give out medical advice. I can tell you our experience, but, I definitely don't claim to be an expert, but I always have a listening ear for anybody that's going through something similar.
Well, I think one of the lessons in all these things is even the experts don't know everything, right? They tell us, and the brain is just really amazing because it's so plastic. You can remove a part of the brain, and another part of the brain can take that over. So, when people ask, will Lauren ever be normal? It's like, first of all, what does normal even mean?
Yeah.
And she could keep improving. We don't really know. We don't know as much as we think that we do. And there have been people that have been born with very little brain at all that have very high IQs. I just heard this a few weeks ago that people like no brain and have super high IQs.
Yeah, the brain is amazing, and nobody knows, but we're gonna just keep powering through.
Yeah, well, you guys, I'm really glad to have met you, have this conversation. It's so inspirational talking to someone who's gone through and going through. I mean, I don't want to minimize what you're going through now. It's not like life, as you said, doesn't always get easy. We don't have our quota of when this is over, and sometimes we get things that we didn't think we signed up for, but we have to take them and do what we can with them.
Yeah, and I know those that are listening, not everybody's going to look at the video, but I just want to say I love that your daughter is over your shoulder, and seeing her beautiful face is really inspiring for me, and I'm really proud of you for what you're doing, and I'm sure she is too.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. The thing is we talked about earlier, the different types of grief. One of the things I've learned in my life is, not to try to compare. We all do. We're human, right?
Yeah.
So we have a friend whose daughter had brain cancer, and almost exact same age as Shayna. She lived around the corner. We watched her go through that. Shayna passed suddenly. And so as a parent, you go, well, which is worse? Is it better that Shayna was healthy right up to the last moment, but we lost her suddenly, or is it better to know and have that? And then with your situation with Lauren, it's all different. It's all different, and it's all the same. It's all grief.
Yeah, grief
and
is
it's
grief.
all,
yeah,
and it's all a matter of what do we do with it. So I appreciate you being so open to share your story and inspire so many other people, and we can all look at what's good in their life. And I like that. I love that you're doing that. So any last words, anything you want to say to wrap up as we conclude today?
No, the sun will come up tomorrow. Tomorrow will be better. Every day is a little better. Just keep on keeping on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Colleen, it's been really wonderful to meet you. Thanks for being here on Grief to Growth, and I'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Don't forget to like, hit that big red subscribe button, and click the notify bell. Thanks for being here.